Today I want to talk about American political culture as a structural factor that shapes American politics in fundamental ways. There are four elements of our political culture that I want to talk about today. The first, the democratic ethos, something that we've already talked about at some length, so we won't spend a lot of time on that today. We already know, though, right, that it consists of three basic elements: popular sovereignty, political equality, and fundamental rights and liberties. Second, our political culture entails a commitment to classical liberalism, which consists of four basic elements: limited government, competitive individualism, relatively free markets, and limited government. Third, our political culture consists of a tradition of ascriptive hierarchy, a tradition of discrimination on the basis of such immutable characteristics as race, ethnicity, gender, maybe even religious identity. And then finally, we have, as part of our culture, a tradition of a commitment to various religious traditions. So a culture of religiosity. I mean, on the one hand, sure, we have a certain amount of separation between church and state, but there's also, we'll see, a certain amount of intertwining between church and state, that our various religious beliefs definitely shape our politics. The democratic ethos, something that we've already discussed. So we know that that ethos consists of a commitment to rule by the people, rule by the majority, realistically, this thing called popular sovereignty. That shapes our politics in some pretty important ways, obviously. Second, this ethos of democracy entails a commitment to political equality, the idea that each citizen should have the same political influence as every other citizen, or at the very least, one person, one vote. And we'll see that there are some issues there that we need to explore. And then finally, a commitment to the ideal of fundamental rights and liberties possessed by we the people. Originally, of course, as enshrined in the Bill of Rights, a focus there on negative liberty, i.e., the idea was limit the power of government to take away these rights and liberties, but since at least the New Deal in the 1930s, that has expanded to include what's known as positive liberty, recognition that sometimes, especially the federal government, can intervene in order to secure for we the people fundamental rights and liberties, when perhaps these rights and liberties are being taken away by, let's say, state and local governments, as in the case of Jim Crow in the American South, or perhaps when these rights and liberties are being taken away by one's fellow citizens, which can also happen. There are times then we have come to believe when government must actively step in to secure these rights and liberties. Classical liberalism. This is a fundamental part of our political culture. It's a set of ideas handed down to us in the 18th century by such thinkers as Adam Smith, John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, arguably perhaps Thomas Hobbes, Hume, and others. Ideas that took root in a relatively virgin soil, if you will, given that rather tragically the European colonists had largely over time decimated the native peoples, created kind of a tabula rasa, or a blank slate. And so when these ideas of classical liberalism do hit in Europe and elsewhere in the 18th century, I think they take particularly deep root in the somewhat virgin political soil of what became the United States of America. So we see then that this classical liberal tradition entails a commitment to, first, relatively free markets as the way to organize the economy. We see this articulated most clearly and most forcefully in Adam Smith's opus, The Wealth of Nations, published most propitiously in 1776. In this volume, Smith argues forcefully on behalf of relatively free markets as the best way to achieve a fairly prosperous economy. Allow individuals to work competitively in a free market environment, and that will produce a great deal of wealth. Trade barriers also need to be eliminated or minimized because this is another deformation of a relatively free market. So we know then that that's, I mean, we still have that commitment today. It's not quite as pristine as perhaps it once was. Since at least FDR's New Deal in the 1930s, we have also demonstrated a commitment to a relatively large welfare state, and we've also granted to government significant regulatory powers over private enterprise. Albeit that's certainly something that we the people have demanded, and not just in the U.S. but elsewhere. And if anything, we've gone down the road the least distance with regard to developing greater limitations on a relatively free market. Nevertheless, right, since at least the early 20th century, we do have, I think, relatively free markets, but simultaneously we also have a significant welfare state and significant regulatory authority inhering in the hands of government. Second, a commitment to private property. We see this articulated beautifully by John Locke in his second treatise on civil government, in which Locke argues that the protection of private property is one of the fundamental roles of government, and in fact, if government fails to secure that right for those who own property, property owners have the right to engage in revolution. So for John Locke, this is quintessentially what government is about. It's protecting private property. And if it fails to do so, the price should be some form of revolution. And in Locke's view, private property gives people an incentive to work hard, to invest their labor into the land with the understanding that they will retain most of the fruits of that labor, minus, of course, taxation. So for John Locke, this was an important part of the good society, strong protections for private property, clearly part of our political tradition. We see that in the Fifth Amendment, right? The right to private property, of course, like every other right, is not absolute. There are limits on that right, and the Fifth Amendment makes clear what those limits are. Government can take away private property if it's using that property for a public purpose, such as building a highway, let's say. It must also provide, government must provide, due process of law when they are taking someone's private property away from them for public purpose. It's got to be done in a way that's public and transparent and above board and consistent with existing law. And then finally, the Fifth Amendment makes it clear that when government does deprive someone of their private property for public purpose using due process of law, government must provide for those homeowners or those property owners just compensation. A little tricky in practice, but the idea is fairly clear. We see this happening right now with Project Neon as the state is expanding Interstate 15 down near the Strip. Right, some of that has involved a certain amount of eminent domain. Government taking away private property from property owners adjacent to that corridor for public purpose. It must do so in a way that is transparent, simpatico with existing law in Nevada, and the government must provide these owners just compensation. Limited government, the third part of classical liberalism that we want to talk about here. We see that expressed by John Locke in his second treatise on civil government. We the people should have ultimate authority. Government is there to serve we the people. And if government fails to do that, we the people have the right to engage in some form of revolution, hopefully peacefully and orderly, but nevertheless some form of revolution as redress against government that goes too far, that doesn't take care of business. Adam Smith, right, similarly argues for limited government because in order to have relatively free markets, you do need some government, right? Government does provide certain elements that are important to a free market, such as national security, certain public infrastructure like highways. Government needs to provide a system of law that can be used to protect private property. Nevertheless, ultimately, that government must be limited, must not be allowed to become coercive must not behave in ways that are arbitrary or capricious. So ultimately, limited government to secure relatively free markets and secure rights and liberties for we the people. And then finally, classical liberalism entails a commitment to competitive individualism, a belief that fundamentally we are individuals first. Government must respect these individual citizens. They must recognize the value of the individual as an individual. And then these individuals, the theory goes, compete with one another vigorously in the marketplace to secure their own self-interest. Competitive individualism. And in the view of John Locke, in the view of Adam Smith, this is the way that you produce a prosperous society. You recognize, validate, and protect this competitive individualism. Can that go too far? Of course it can. Are we just individuals? I hope not. Aristotle argued 2,500 years ago that yes, we are individuals, but we are also members of a community. That with great power as an individual comes great responsibility, to steal a little bit from Spider-Man. So that we are individuals, and our individualism is an important part of our culture, but our culture also encompasses a recognition that the community is also significant. This tradition again goes back at least to Aristotle, some 2,500 years ago. Competitive individualism, yes, but just recognize that that's not all that we are, albeit it's an important part of who we are under the theory of classical liberalism. Another part of our political culture that shapes our politics as a structural factor, a tradition of ascriptive hierarchy, a tradition from the get-go of discrimination on the basis of certain immutable characteristics such as race, ethnicity, and gender. Slavery is our most horrific example of ascriptive hierarchy built into the Constitution, systematic discrimination on the basis of race. So that's built into the fabric of our country, no question about it. Other manifestations of that tradition, the failure by the founders to guarantee the enfranchisement of women. Discrimination meted out against Chinese immigrants who were brought here in the 19th century to help build the railroads. Once those railroads were built, these Chinese immigrants became persona non grata, and Congress enacted certain restrictions on immigration from Asian countries. Not our finest hour. The internment of Japanese Americans after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Again, probably not our finest hour. Endorsed by the Supreme Court as consistent with due process of law, but in retrospect we know that there was no due process of law, that this mass internment of Japanese Americans, who many thought might be more loyal to the motherland of Japan than to their adopted country. There was no evidence of any of that going on, and yet over 100,000 Japanese Americans were forcibly relocated to these camps in the western deserts after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. The nation's historically atrocious treatment of First Nation people, pushing Native Americans further and further west onto less and less desirable land, and a host of other treatments that are genuinely tragic and not our finest hour as a nation state. A tradition of anti-Semitism against those of the Jewish faith, and Jim Crow, as we've discussed, right? With the collapse of Reconstruction in 1876, we see the rise of Jim Crow, which is another example of ascriptive hierarchy. Now, all of that being said, let's try to end on a more optimistic note. I would say that over time, our tradition of ascriptive hierarchy, although it's very real, has been eroded significantly by some of our other cultural traditions, right? A tradition of a commitment to the democratic ethos, a culture of a commitment to classical liberalism, and even some of our religious traditions, I think, have put pressure on ascriptive hierarchy, has resulted in a diminishing tradition over time of ascriptive hierarchy, much to our credit as a nation state. Another part of our political culture that I want to talk about today is our tradition of religiosity, there from the beginning, right? Where we started out as a mostly Christian nation, albeit, let's add an important caveat to that observation. We know that the founding fathers were, by and large, what we might call Christian light, kind of low-calorie Christian. Christian, yes, but mostly deistic, right? Mostly of the belief that there was a creator that was mostly unknowable. That creator kicked things off, perhaps with something like the Big Bang, and then mostly stood back to let things play out as we the people decided with our various choices over time. Now we also know that over time we have become much more religiously diverse, a much wider tradition now of various religious beliefs that have made our politics, if you will, increasingly interesting, shall we say. And let's be clear. These various religious traditions have shaped our politics in important ways from the beginning. We could look most obviously, I think, to what we've already discussed, the Black Civil Rights Movement. And we know that that movement was led by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And we know that the movement organizers used black churches to organize some of these demonstrations and marches. We know that Dr. King often invoked religious language to advance the cause of racial justice, arguing that the law of God mandated an end to Jim Crow. Look, King also made secular arguments about the meaning of the 14th Amendment and so forth. Along with those secular claims, he also advanced distinctly religious claims. So you cannot understand the Black Civil Rights Movement without knowing something about the role of religion in that movement. Heck, a lot of the songs that the civil rights protesters sang were rooted in the traditions of the black church in the South. Contemporary issues, right, such as same-sex marriage or abortion. These are often discussed and debated using religious terms, using references, for example, to the Bible. So again, can you understand contemporary American debates over things like same-sex marriage and abortion without taking into account the importance of religion for so many people? I would submit you cannot. That must be taken into account. I think historically, political scientists gave short shrift to the role of religion in politics because it seemed somehow inconsistent with this idea of a separation between church and state. Yes, we do have some separation in America between church and state, right? See the First Amendment, the Establishment Clause, but we also have something called the Free Exercise Clause that validates the right of all people to express their religious beliefs and practices in ways that they see fit to do so, which can include, right, participating in debates over political issues. So indeed, it is a tricky thing. The dance can get quite complex. You want to get the right mix here, but no question, over time, we have seen that our various religious traditions and beliefs have shaped our politics in some pretty fundamental ways. Are we becoming over time a bit less religious? Evidence suggests that we are, like just about every other Western nation. In fact, other Western nations have gone much further than us in becoming increasingly secular and less religious. Nevertheless, we are still a pretty deeply religious people, and to understand our politics, we need to know something about our religious traditions. To summarize and to make some concluding observations, we have a political culture that is large and complex, much like America is. Political culture consists of at least 4 traditions: a tradition of the democratic ethos, a tradition of classical liberalism, a tradition of ascriptive hierarchy, and a tradition of religiosity. In many ways, these various cultural commitments are synergistic. For example, our democratic ethos entails a commitment to fundamental rights and liberties, which works very well with our commitment to classical liberalism. As classical liberalism, right, includes an emphasis on the right of private property. So private property is central to classical liberalism. It's also central to our notion of fundamental rights and liberties. It's a very synergistic part of our culture. They work together well, like peanut butter and chocolate. Now, on the other hand, there's also parts of our large and sprawling political culture that are antagonistic one with another. Most clearly, you see it in our commitment to political equality, often tested by the massive fact that in a country committed to relatively free markets and so forth, you're going to have a lot of wealth inequality. Right now, today, we have a huge amount of wealth inequality. And what does that translate into? It often translates into political inequality. That if you're a billionaire, like let's say the Koch brothers, or Sheldon Adelson, or Steve Wynn, you're going to be able to translate that material plenty into disproportionate political influence. If, on the other hand, you are working class, working poor, maybe homeless even, your lack of material resources will also mean that you're going to have very little in the way of political resources. So, in short, material inequalities are at odds with political equality, and so there's an antagonism there. So that becomes part of the way that we should think about our politics, right? You cannot have 100% of everything. You cannot have, I would submit, 100% of both classical liberalism and the democratic ethos. Often trade-offs have to be made, choices made. We try to figure out what's the right mix of both political equality but also classical liberalism. How do you get that right? Does that include some notion of a welfare state, some notion of a progressive income tax? How far do you go with that in the name of political equality before you start to lose too much of classical liberalism? Now, that's an ongoing battle with no clear answers, constantly being debated. And then we can also observe something that we've already observed, right? The fact that over time, I believe, without getting sort of wild and crazy about it or being willfully naive, I do believe that over time, our tradition of ascriptive hierarchy has been eroded by some of our other traditions, such as a belief in political equality or a belief in fundamental rights and liberties. That's inconsistent with, right, ascriptive hierarchy. And I think over time, the democratic ethos has been winning, if you will. The tradition of ascriptive hierarchy, I think, has been, in a sense, losing ground to that democratic ethos.